I am Lauren Ashford Rain, 36 years old. I used to believe that if I stayed useful, stayed silent, stayed exact, they would remember I was one of them. But then I received an invitation with my name listed after the children of people who never served, folded neatly beside a pressed uniform I hadn't worn in years. The photo matters more than the people in it. My father once muttered to a staff photographer, thinking I couldn't hear. And I understood sometimes. You are not forgotten. You are arranged. I don't remember the last time someone used my full name without a purpose. Evelyn Grant called while I was unpacking the last of my duffel bags. She always phoned around the same time just after dinner, just before silence set into the walls of her old porch. Her voice cracked the same way screen doors do when the hinges are tired. "They're meeting Sunday, right?" she asked casually, like it was common knowledge. "I assume you'll be there." I didn't answer right away. The laundry cycle behind me buzzed its final note, and I folded a worn t-shirt without looking at it. The kind I only wore off base. The kind no one ever asked about. I hadn't heard I replied. A pause, not long, just enough to widen the space between us. Oh, well, maybe they forgot to say she said. "But your mother, Helen, always spoke proudly of you. You know that, right?" The towel in my hand had a loose thread at the corner. I picked at it with my thumb. "Did she?" "Well, yes," Evelyn whispered, and then changed the subject too quickly. "The garden's blooming early this year. I'll set some aside for you if you pass by." I thanked her, though I didn't plan to pass by. Not anymore. That night, I opened the old family group thread. It had been muted for over a year, but not removed. There were pictures of mason jars filled with peach preserves, a forwarded recipe for deviled eggs, a few off-key jokes from Uncle Dale about tractor prices. Then a flurry of messages from Chloe. "Meeting prep. Bring printed records." Meredith responded with bullet points. Frank gave a thumbs-up emoji. No one had mentioned me. I scrolled back further, scanning for my name, like someone searching a crowd for a familiar face that isn't there. I hovered above the reply bar, typed, "Was there a meeting planned? Should I bring the deed copy?" The typing bubble blinked once, then stopped. Nothing followed. The next morning, I was folding a stack of towels, the kind that still smelled faintly of base detergent. My phone buzzed once on the edge of the counter. Helen Rain. Her voice came through as crisp and dry as the cotton napkins she ironed for church luncheons. "Lauren, better you don't come. It's already handled." "Handled!" That word slid across the air like a chair being pushed away from a table that was never meant for me. I looked out the window at the back edge of the yard, where the dogwood tree used to grow. Nothing had replaced it. Nothing ever did. My mother didn't say goodbye. I didn't either. The call ended like a hallway light turning off mid-sentence. I stayed in the kitchen a while longer, towel still in my hand. On the wall near the door hung a cloth rack, and tucked neatly in the second rung was the linen Evelyn had given me when I graduated West Point. It was hand-stitched, pale green, and embroidered with tiny black initials, LAR. I had never used it. Never dared. It felt too personal to stain. They hadn't removed me from the meeting. Not officially, not with a word, but silence has a way of making its own declarations. That afternoon I opened the drawer in the mudroom where we kept spare documents and old receipts. My copy of the land certificate was still there, folded into thirds yellowing at the creases. I stared at the signature line mine and wondered whether anyone still considered it valid. Whether presence still mattered when memory didn't. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the clock above the pantry door. It was the only thing in that room still keeping time. No one had said I didn't belong, but they planned, coordinated, and confirmed without me. They divided property-assigned roles and chose a date, all without the courtesy of a mission. I wasn't cut out. I was overwritten. Later that evening, I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of peppermint tea that had long gone cold. The rim of the cup was chipped, barely visible unless you turned it toward the light. I traced that edge slowly with one finger. I had always assumed erasure would look like conflict-raised voices slammed doors, a single dramatic fracture that made the split visible, but here it was softer than that, almost polite, almost forgetful, almost. I didn't cry. There was no reason to. What would I have mourned? An invitation, a seat at a table where my name was already missing. When I stood to rinse the mug, the linen still hung untouched. The initials faced outward. I remember Evelyn once told me when I was 13 and furious about a cancelled fireworks show, sometimes absence speaks louder than explosions. She wasn't wrong. That evening, I walked out onto the porch. The air carried no sound except the rustling of dry leaves against the fence line. Across the way, Evelyn's porch light flickered on like it always did at dusk. She hadn't forgotten. The kitchen behind me stayed dark. I didn't reach for the switch. I stood there until the last of the orange faded from the sky towel still folded in my hand, initials still pressed into the cloth name, still unwritten in the places I used to think I belonged. And I realized sometimes the cruelest distance doesn't come from being sent away. It comes from no one noticing you never arrived. I used to believe that being useful was the same as being wanted. There was a year I flew home 2 days earlier than scheduled. A readiness drill had been postponed, and I used the gap to land in Missouri, just in time for Dad's birthday barbecue. I arrived unannounced, still in my field boots, carrying a bottle of rye I picked up from the PX wrapped in brown paper. No one opened the door when I knocked. I stood there for a while, until Meredith passed by the hallway window and motioned for me to let myself in. Her expression didn't change. The bottle was never opened. When I left 3 hours later, it was still sitting on the kitchen counter, unopened next to an empty vase. I used to think if I compressed myself into something smaller, shorter, visits shorter, updates, shorter replies, then maybe they'd stop bracing for my presence. I'd shorten my leaves to match their schedules. Missed Christmases, missed vacations, missed anything that might have resembled a life of my own. Each time I was promoted, I sent a message in the family thread. Nothing formal, just a line or two. Once after making lieutenant colonel, I typed, "Pinning ceremony went well. Command next month." Chloe replied within 15 minutes. Liam just got invited to a private roundtable at Deloitte. Big names. I had a habit back then of rereading messages I had already received, as if repetition would summon relevance. There was a winter when I wired $3,000 home. The roof was leaking in 2 places, and I remembered the way Mom's shoulder always ached in damp weather. No one replied directly. The next day, someone posted a photo in the group Liam, in a tailored navy suit standing on a Manhattan rooftop. The caption read, "Made it to the Empire Mixer. Sharp as hell." The suit wasn't wrinkled. The roof probably still was. I didn't say anything. Not to them. Not to myself. It became a ritual giving without the possibility of return, as though worth was something that accumulated in silence. There's a strange comfort in being unthanked. It lets you pretend there's still room for surprise. At family gatherings, I spoke softly and never interrupted. I offered to set the table, bring ice-sliced bread. Once Dad dropped a bottle of ketchup. I caught it before it hit the tile. He didn't look up, just continued his conversation with Uncle Dale. There was a conversation one year in the den while the football game played on low volume. I stood behind the couch, sipping from a sweating glass of lemonade. Dad, speaking to someone I didn't recognize, laughed and said, "Girls do fine in uniform, long as they know when to stop. Lieutenant's a good place to level out." He didn't look at me when he said it. He didn't have to. Another time, Ethan, always polished, always slightly performative, watched me open my laptop to scan field maps for a late deployment. "Still doing digital stuff?" he asked. "Can't imagine that's real combat." No one corrected him. I remember once pouring tea for Mom while she looked through Liam's new headshots for his LinkedIn. She turned the screen to show me tapping the frame. "This one, the lighting's perfect. Makes him look competent without trying too hard." The tea over-steeped. She didn't notice. At some point, I stopped bringing stories home. Not out of defiance, just fatigue. I used to think every detail might earn a question, maybe even an echo of interest. What was it like leading that op? Were you scared when the comms dropped? How did you keep your team calm? But I stopped speaking long before I stopped hoping. The silence was quieter when I participated in it. There's a photograph in my storage locker, faded and folded at the corners. It shows me at 12, hunched over a yellow legal pad in the kitchen, scribbling Morse code from a Navy surplus manual. My elbows were sharp, my socks mismatched. Through the window behind me, the rest of the family is outside grilling and laughing under strings of lights. No one was watching me and I wasn't watching them. But I remember thinking, if I could just get it right, if I could crack the whole alphabet without looking, maybe someone would lean in and say, "Come outside. We're waiting on you." They never did. The kitchen in that house always smelled like cloves and polish in December. Every drawer had a rattle to it, every cabinet stuck. I memorized which spoons clinked against which bowls when I loaded the dishwasher. Small things that made me believe I was part of the rhythm, even if I was never in the frame. Later, when I lived alone, I'd find myself polishing silverware with alt cores. Not because it was dirty, because I had learned that care wasn't always for the object. Sometimes it was for the silence that came after. There's a scar near the bend of my right thumb from slicing citrus too fast while prepping Christmas Eve punch the year they ran out of oranges. I never ointed it out, never let it blister. It healed faint and smooth. No one commented on the effort, but the bowl was full, and that was enough. Back then, enough just meant no one noticed you failed. When I packed for deployments, I made sure to include a pressed shirt for each return trip home, hoping sharp lines would translate into belonging, hoping maybe someone would ask if I had needed help folding it. No one ever did. These weren't wounds, not in the usual sense. They were reminders. Little ones, like splinters too shallow to remove. Sometimes I think back to the porch steps, how the top one always dipped a little in the center. I used to sit there at age 15, with my knees pulled tight, listening to the clatter of beer bottles from the backyard. The fire pit crackled. Music played from someone's Bluetooth speaker. I traced words into the dust with my big toe and waited for someone to say we forgot the plates, or we need one more for cards. The call never came, so I kept tracing. I thought maybe if I spelled ready enough times someone would look up and realize I was already there. But they didn't. They never looked up, and eventually I stopped waiting for them to, because silence, when repeated often enough, stops sounding like neglect. It starts to sound like home. I never knew that being invisible could leave such clear outlines. The store still smelled like dried dill and floor wax, the kind that stuck to the soles of your shoes and whispered when you moved across the aisle. It hadn't changed much. The same squeaky wire racks, the same rusted price tags that no one ever replaced, and the same clerk, Mrs. Dawson, with her hair pinned back too tight and a voice that never fully touched the words she used. She blinked when she saw me, then her lips pulled into something polite. "Didn't expect to see you," she murmured, handing over the paper bag before I even finished reaching for it. "Family gatherings this weekend, isn't it?" I adjusted my grip on the bag, pretending not to hear the edge in her tone. The kind that wasn't cruel, just informed. "I figured you'd be there," she added more softly now. "They're giving out that new family crest thing, I think. Real official. Helen's planning something big." The receipt was folded into quarters. She slipped it in without waiting for a reply. I nodded once and left without comment. The bag rustled in the passenger seat, 2 sleeves of fig cookies and a small jar of local honey clinking together. I used to bring them every spring for Pop. He never had the heart to tell me he didn't like figs. He just smoked, pulled up a stool and opened them anyway. Back on the road, the radio played low static between country ballads. I didn't change the station. Some noise was better left untuned. There was a time I got a wedding invitation in the mail, a cream cardstock with pressed gold edging. It was from Ethan, my cousin, the one who always smiled too much when cameras were near. The envelope read, "Ethan Rain and guest." There was no name, not even a pretense of knowing who I might bring, as if I didn't exist alone, but only as an optional +1. I remember flipping the envelope over, scanning it again for my first name, then scanning the guest list on the back page. I wasn't seated at a family table. I was slotted between 2 friends from his grad program. The RSVP stayed blank. I didn't mail it back. I didn't go. Another year, I received a message short-clipped, unpunctuated 2 hours after the base had awarded me a commendation for tactical excellence. I was still in uniform, still holding the envelope, when it buzzed on my phone. "Con có thấy hình mồi của Liam với thượng nghị sĩ không đẹp như anh bìa tạp chí?" That was it. "No con joy lắm nó chúc mừng nơ bố mẹ tự hào." Just a redirection to someone shinier, someone smoother, someone whose suit always fit, and who never missed a photo opportunity. There was no need to reply. She wouldn't have noticed if I did. I once mailed home a framed replica of my first campaign medal, engraved beneath with the date and coordinates. I wrapped it in brown craft paper, tied it with cotton twine. I imagined it resting on the mantel between the family Bible and the ceramic deer that had been chipped since I was 7. Weeks passed. When I finally asked if it had arrived, Mom replied, "It's in the hallway cabinet. Phong kak new unroy. Treo tem chat." The cabinet where we kept replacement batteries and the Christmas tree light cords that always tangled. The medal fit right in. I found it 2 years later when I visited for Thanksgiving, still wrapped. The corner of the paper had begun to curl. There are things you don't need to open to know they weren't wanted. That Thanksgiving, I set the table quietly. Liam walked in with a Bluetooth headset clipped to one ear. I asked if he needed help with the wine bottles. He glanced at my sleeves. "Didn't know they let officers wear that many stripes on fatigues." He smirked. No one corrected him. I stirred the gravy while he told the others about blockchain investing. No one looked up. Sometimes in my barracks, I'd stare at the ID card wedged between pages of my journal. The corners had begun to peel. The lamination cracked along the top edge. That ID had seen more border crossings than I'd seen holidays. It never failed to scan. There's a photograph I carry. It's folded in half, tucked in the lining of my sleeping bag. Most nights I forget it's there until my hand brushes it by accident. Me and Pop sitting on the edge of his porch swing. I'm 16. He's holding a worn paperback copy of Hatchet Thumb between pages. I remember the way he cleared his throat before speaking. You'll do more than any of them, Lauren. Just make sure it's for the right reasons. He died 3 months later. That photo is the last thing with my name and a promise in the same frame. Every now and then I unfold it. The crease down the middle has nearly erased his hand. It doesn't matter. I still remember the weight of it resting on my shoulder. No ceremony. No applause. Just the quiet certainty of being seen once fully and never again. I never laminated the photo. Letting it wear felt right, and I think that's the difference no one teaches you. Loud memories fade. It's the quiet ones that echo. Sometimes absence is not a mistake, it's a decision wrapped in ceremony. The corner of my office desk bore a small indentation barely noticeable unless you ran a fingertip over it. A dent likely from a dropped stapler or a forgotten mug. I'd traced that dip every Monday morning for years. This time I hovered over it without touching. Samuels appeared beside me, silent, not out of hesitation, but out of some unspoken respect neither of us had earned but observed anyway. He placed the tablet carefully on my desk. No words. The screen tilted just enough to catch the glare from the overhead lights. The video loaded without volume. A morning talk show, bright stage lights, smiling anchor, and Ethan Rain seated like he belonged there. My cousin wore his dress uniform like a tailored truth brass, gleaming insignia aligned as if they meant something permanent. A ticker rolled across the bottom of the screen. The mind behind Operation Iron Echo. I had seen those words before, on the briefing folders I used to sign, except back then, they followed my name. Ethan leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowed just enough to simulate humility. A trained gesture. He clasped his hands not too tight, not too loose, then spoke. The host watched him with practiced awe. I recognized the language before the subtitles rolled. We had to choose between holding the perimeter or protecting the evac zone. I made the call. Airstrike in 40 seconds. Not everyone agreed. The phrase landed like a tap on bone. It was mine. I'd set it into a cracked radio hunched under a tarp in the dead zone, between two collapsing rooftops. I hadn't said it for drama. I'd said it because people needed to move or die. His voice trembled just enough to catch the camera's mercy. We didn't leave anyone behind. He paused, blinked. I still remember their faces. A single tear slid down his cheek, like it had been waiting backstage. I reached for the tablet. The frame had a faint fracture near the volume button, small but sharp, a crack running directly across his last name. No one in the comm suite moved. I didn't look up. The air in the room shifted the way it does after someone speaks a truth no one wants to confirm. Back at my desk, I opened the archived broadcast on my own terminal. Tags filled the metadata panel. Heroism, decisive leadership, young innovators. No mention of Ashford. No Rain either, not the part of it that belonged to me. My hand hovered over the desk phone longer than I intended. Eventually I touched the receiver, then paused again. The screen read, simply, Dad. Not Harrison. Not Colonel. Just 3 letters that used to mean presence. He picked up on the first ring. You saw it, didn't you? I didn't answer. He handled it well. Polished. He's learning composure. Silence grew thick across the line. He didn't fill it with apology. He filled it with rationale. Ethan needed something more visible. And you're already a lieutenant colonel. There's no harm in letting the family name shine through him for a while. A while. He'll be helping the legacy. Legacy. Not integrity. Not record. Just a word that floats above actual labor and lands where cameras are pointed. I moved my thumb across a small scratch on my ID badge, a shallow groove near the corner where I'd once taped a list of emergency codes. The tape was long gone. The skin underneath still remembered its place. On the second shelf of my cabinet was the original operation map, folded, annotated and faded where sweat had blurred ink. The corners had curled like dry leaves. It smelled faintly of graphite and something older, maybe burnt wiring from the forward base's faulty power unit. I laid it flat. Every arrow, circle, and timestamp had been placed by my hand in field gear, not in a studio. Ethan's version had no ink, only vector graphics and high-gloss overlays. Even the drone footage had been filtered for contrast, as if war needed definition. I reached for the mission transcript, the real one. Mine. The one where names were misspelled because people had been bleeding too hard to spell correctly. The one where timestamps didn't align with satellite logs because latency was worse than usual that night. I'd circled the gaps in red. No one else had. When I asked for an official clarification through command, they told me the messaging team had finalized attribution. Public-facing credits needed to reflect narrative alignment. That was the term, narrative alignment. I once kept a silver tie bar in my drawer, a gift from Pop the day I shipped out to OCS. It had his initials scratched into the back with a nail. I hadn't worn it in years, it didn't match the newer uniforms, but I'd never thrown it out. That morning I found it beneath a stack of awards I hadn't dusted in months. Still cold, still real. The hallway light flickered again. 3rd week in a row. The maintenance form had been filed, but no one followed up. The base had learned to ignore minor faults. I hadn't. I walked to the mirror that hung unevenly near the supply closet. My reflection hadn't changed. The same half-loose bun, the same regulation jacket, but something had shifted in how the name tag sat on the fabric. It felt borrowed. I didn't speak the thought aloud, but it sat heavy in my throat. They didn't forget me. They revised the draft and erased me with precision, not as oversight, as intent. The mirror caught the overhead light in a strange way, split the reflection slightly, so it looked like there were 2 of me. One watching, one gone. There's a difference between being forgotten and being overwritten. Only one of them has a producer. I used to think the loudest sound was the slamming of a door, but silence has a heavier echo. I left the family group chat without ceremony. No announcement, no passive-aggressive gifs, just tapped leave and watched the screen refresh. No one messaged after, not even an accidental oops. The chat balloon disappeared as if I'd never been in it. The banner used to read, Ashford, Legacy, Private. Legacy didn't need my confirmation. In my second desk drawer beneath a folded tax envelope and 2 old dental appointment cards sat a black field journal. It had survived 7 deployments, 3 sandstorms, and 1 monsoon. I had used it for root grids backup access codes and unreadable shorthand I'd invented to feel like I was in control. I flipped to a blank page and wrote with the same pen I'd carried during Iron Echo, the same one I refused to lend to anyone else, not out of ego, but because it didn't leak. Tactical withdrawal is not surrender. It is quiet repositioning with precise intent. No underline, no commentary, just that. I closed the journal and slid it beneath the tax envelope. The drawer didn't creak when I shut it, but I waited a moment longer than needed with my hand on the handle, just to feel the finality. At work, I arrived earlier than even maintenance. I passed through security badge still active and entered my office without turning on the light. The framed commendation sat where it always had left shelf, angled 3 degrees off-center. It had a chip in the bottom right corner, barely noticeable unless you knew where to look. The chip came from the day Pop tried to dust around it, his hand unsteady from meds. He never admitted it. I picked it up, wiped the glass with the corner of my sleeve, and laid it gently in the cardboard box I'd brought. I wrapped each medal in an old microfiber cloth. Not for their protection, they were fine. It was for mine. Each time the cloth passed over a ribbon, I remembered the handshakes, the staged photos, the gloved fingers pinning them to my uniform while my name was pronounced correctly for once. And still no one asked if I wanted to keep them up. No one even asked if the wall felt like mine. At the back of the bookshelf was a rusted paperclip I hadn't touched in years. It had held together a leave request. I never submitted one that might have taken me home for Pop's birthday. I stared at the paperclip, then let it fall into the box like a pin being returned to a grenade. I removed the crest from the wall. It left a faint square of unfaded paint. I didn't cover it. I left the corkboard bare. At the admin bay, I passed by Julie, who was setting up the print station. Her eyes met mine briefly, then flicked toward the empty walls behind me. I nodded once. She didn't say anything. That was enough. I dropped a white envelope into the office drop box. Inside was the secondary debit card my mother used to manage logistics. She never called it money. Logistics made it sound noble. I hadn't used the card in months, but the withdrawal alert still popped up on my old bank email. Small things. Gas at Shell. A nail salon near her church. Something labeled Gift Emporium the week of Liam's engagement party. When I returned the card, I didn't include a note. No explanation. Just initials on the seal the way she signed birthday cards M. I walked home. No music, no earbuds, just the hollow echo of my boots on the sidewalk. The front step of my apartment had a crack down the middle. I'd been meaning to fix it. The split had widened since winter, and weeds now peeked through in quiet defiance. Inside the room felt still not empty, not full, just honest. I pulled the curtains open halfway, letting in a soft ribbon of light that landed square on the bookshelf, catching the corner of a photo frame. It was the one from my commissioning ceremony, dress blues, shoulder straight, smile tight. My father's reflection had been caught behind the glass that day unintentionally. A ghost figure just over my left shoulder. You could only see him if you looked long enough. I had looked too long, too many times. I didn't remove the frame. I simply turned it around. The back was worn with a paper stand that never quite held upright unless you adjusted it twice. I folded it flat, pressed it closed. The photo didn't shatter. There was no final snap, just a silent submission to gravity. I moved through the apartment slowly, not to delay, but to notice. A stack of coasters still held water rings from last week. The worn rug in the hallway curled slightly at the corners. A shirt I no longer wore hung on the back of a chair's shoulders, too padded, cut too sharp. I folded it into the donation bag. In the small drawer near the kitchen sink was a pile of grocery receipts and old stamps. I found the flyer from the Academy alumni banquet I had once planned to attend. It was glossy formal with gold embossing. A photo of Ethan was on the cover now. I hadn't noticed that before. He was shaking hands with a colonel I once trained under. I turned the flyer over and slid it under the recycling stack without tearing it. The fridge ummed behind me like a quiet, indifferent witness. That afternoon I logged into the media office portal. There was a drop-down menu labelled Event Visibility. I selected Withdraw from upcoming press materials. A second question popped up. Do you require a substitute spokesperson? I clicked No. There was no box, for I was never their story to begin with. My thumb hovered over the submit button, then tapped. That night, I laid the ceremonial sash across the back of my chair. I'd never worn it. It still had the tag stitched in with the base code and Ashford L neatly embroidered. I ran my fingers over the lettering, then folded it into its plastic sleeve and tucked it inside a drawer. The drawer closed softly. No resistance. In the corner of the room, a storage bin waited with other things I wasn't yet ready to call memorabilia. Just items in transition. Some uniforms, a bundle of dried eucalyptus tied with string, a compass I'd received after my final field evaluation. The needle still spun even when the case was still. I left the lid open. I didn't tell anyone I was done. No declarations, no public exit, just a gradual unthreading of my presence from the places they used to track me. At 8:12 p.m., the porch light of the building across the street flicked on. Evelyn Grant's place. She always turned it on early like Grandma used to. A small amber glow against a dark street. I stood in the center of my apartment and looked at the bookshelf. 3 titles leaned slightly forward as if reaching. One of them, Pop's old Morse manual, still had the bent corner I'd left as a kid. He once told me if I ever got lost, that book would remind me how to send a signal. I didn't need to signal anymore. They weren't looking. They never were. I didn't realize how quiet freedom could be until I stopped asking who it should belong to. The cabin was already furnished when I arrived, though furnished felt generous. A table with limigs uneven by half an inch. A mattress that smelled faintly of cedar and old tobacco, and a single wall shelf holding a chipped ceramic bowl and a glass jar half filled with mismatched screws. I didn't bring much with me. Just one duffel. No medals, no uniforms, no photographs. The mailbox had the name M.L. Carpenter written in faded black marker. I never met him. The woman who sold me the cabin said he passed 3 winters ago, just after shoveling the walkway one last time. His boots were still on the porch, laces tied like he meant to come back. I left them there. In the corner of the back room, I found a copy of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, its spine bowed, pages yellowed at the edges. Tucked inside was a torn receipt from a bait shop in Heber Springs. I left that too. The book stayed on the rough-hewn table near the stove next to a chipped mug that held nothing now but a dust ring and a curled leaf that must have blown in through the screen. Mornings came without urgency. I brewed coffee on the gas burner, poured it into the same mug each day. No one asked for reports. No one watched my hands. The cabin didn't need permission to settle around me. It simply did. The walls had once been painted army green. I covered them with clay-colored paint from a hardware store in town. The label read Smoky Terracotta. It took 2 coats. The smell lingered like wet stone, familiar and unintrusive. I peeled off the framed military commendation that had hung crooked above the fireplace nails, resisting plaster flaking. The wall behind it breathed differently, freed from years of forced display. I folded the uniform I'd brought in a vacuum-sealed bag, tucked it into a wooden crate, and slid it beneath the bed. I didn't burn it. I didn't keep it out. Some things don't need ceremonies. They only need to be out of sight. Lunch was usually eggs and toast or boiled potatoes with salt. I ate alone, not out of isolation, but choice. Sometimes I turned on the old AM radio. The signal cracked often, but I could still catch the local station just past noon, classic country or preachers with smooth voices. I preferred the music. It never asked for anything in return. On the third evening, I found a grocery list in the drawer beside the stove. Matches, vinegar, peanut brittle. It was written in blocky handwriting, likely M.L. Carpenter's. I added my own rice mint graphite pencils. I never crossed his items off. The nights were the easiest part. Not because they were peaceful, but because no one expected me to perform silence anymore. Silence here was just quiet. Not erasure. I started walking the trail behind the cabin at dawn, just as the dew was letting go of the tall grass. I carried no phone, no weapon, just a penknife and a folded cloth napkin. Once I found a rabbit snare still tied to a tree root. I untangled it and laid it on a flat stone like an offering to the life it forgot to take. The first letter came folded into a plain envelope with no return address. The postmark read, South Dakota. Inside a single sentence written in neat cursive, "Thank you for not leaving me behind. Cole Metry." I held the envelope against my chest, then laid it in the drawer with the bait shop receipt. I didn't write back. Some acknowledgements don't ask to be returned. They're complete the moment they arrive. I stopped checking the news. There was always another segment, another ribbon, another headline with the name that wasn't mine. It didn't sting anymore. It just felt over. There was a jacket hanging on a nail by the door, canvas worn thin at the elbows, with one of the buttons replaced by a nickel drilled through the center. I wore it each time I went into town. It smelled faintly of sage and dust. The clerk at the general store called me Miss Carpenter once. I didn't correct him. At the diner, I took a corner booth and always ordered black coffee with a biscuit. One afternoon, the waitress poured me a second cup without asking. Her name tag read, Jolene. She looked about 70. Her hand hovered near my shoulder as she set the cup down. Quiet ones usually stay longer than the loud ones, she said. I nodded, folding the sugar packet but never tearing it open. There were no visitors, not from the base, not from family. I had taken my name off the alumni roster and unsubscribed from all official newsletters. One email had the subject line, Legacy Recognition Ceremony, Past and Present Leaders. I deleted it without opening. In the attic crawl space, I found a cigar box filled with old matchbooks and Polaroids. Most were of fishing trips and blurry landscapes, but one showed a young woman in fatigues, holding a trophy the size of her torso. On the back, someone had scrawled, "She beat them all." No name. Just that sentence. I placed it near the Marcus Aurelius book. Maybe she lived here once, or maybe M.L. Carpenter knew someone who mattered quietly. In the evenings, I listened to the wind through the pine trees. It didn't roar, it sifted. Sometimes I pressed my palm against the window just to feel how the cold gathered on the glass without asking for anything in return. No medals hung there, no echoes of rank, just my breath fogging the pain. The stove made a low pop as the fire adjusted itself. I didn't light candles. I didn't journal. I sat in the chair that groaned when I leaned back holding a wool blanket that had unraveled near the fringe. One thread looped around my thumb. I let it stay. When the letter came from Fort Langdon 2 weeks later, I didn't open it. The envelope was thick, official weighty. I slid it beneath the floorboard near the window ledge. I'd removed that board months ago when I found the hollow underneath. It had held nothing but 2 brass buttons and a silver earring tarnished to the point of anonymity. I placed the letter beside them. No return address. But I recognized the seal. Some people wait a lifetime to be recognized. Others walk away the second they realize recognition was never the point. I used to polish my boots every Sunday, even when no inspection loomed. Now I kept a pair of soft-soled leather shoes by the door. Scuffed, broken in. No shine. I watched mold bloom in the grout behind the kitchen sink one morning. Just a faint crescent. I didn't bleach it. I didn't scrub. I left it to spread if it wanted. It had its own reasons for growing. That was the thing I'd never understood before. Not everything needed fixing. Some things just needed to be let be. I've learned that silence doesn't always mean absence. Sometimes it means someone's calculating the right angle to reappear. The subject line arrived just before dawn. Family needs a unified image. The name in the sender field took longer to register Liam Rain. Not a call, not a message, not even a hesitation. Just a formal request in bold font, sitting in my inbox like a memo from an unfamiliar department. The kind of message that pretends distance never grew between paragraphs. Attached was a flyer Ashford Centennial celebration, honoring 100 years of legacy and leadership. Red, white, and navy borders, a crest I hadn't worn in a decade. Below that, a list titled Honored Contributors. My name rested quietly at the bottom, below a high school debate award for Ethan's youngest, and a bullet point about the family vineyard expansion. They wanted me there. Not because I had returned, because they needed the optics. The invitation read like a press kit. Dress code formal. Event theme resilience. Suggested attire for honorary service representation. Preferred decorations encouraged. There was no RSVP deadline, just a sentence near the bottom. Presence affirms unity. Later that afternoon, the phone rang once and stopped. Then again, twice in quick rhythm, the pattern my mother used when she didn't want to leave a voicemail. I let it continue. Eventually it rang again, this time, long enough for the caller ID to flash her full name. Helen Ashford Rain. I didn't answer. The message came instead as text. Just 12 words reporters might attend. Dad thinks it's best if we look cohesive. No punctuation, no greeting, no question. The implication wasn't veiled. It was dressed up, escorted to the center, and lit from above. I was not being asked. I was being positioned. On the kitchen table sat the same chipped clay bowl I'd used to mix paint weeks ago. It still bore faint swirls of burnt umber in the base. I ran my fingers over its rim and tried to remember the last time my mother asked how I'd been, not what I could wear, represent, or reinforce. Nothing surfaced. When I enlisted, she called it a phase of overcompensation. When I received my commission, she mailed a Hallmark card signed only Mother, as if that would suffice. But when Ethan earned his master's in public policy, she threw a banquet. 4 floral arrangements, 2 string quartets, and a wine list printed on ivory cardstock. I folded the printed invitation into thirds and set it under the kettle. The paper warped slightly from heat, but didn't tear. Even now it held its shape. A second message followed from Liam. Shorter this time. Will you be in full dress uniform? Media might ask for a photo. I stared at the message until the screen dimmed. Then I reached for the spiral-bound tactics log I'd kept through the final phase of Iron Echo. Most pages were filled with maps, call signs, backup strategies. One page written in pencil and pressed deep from tension read, "Not all enemies fire rounds." Some send invitations. The graphite had smudged slightly at the edges, but the meaning remained intact. There was no rage, no internal storm. Just a tightening in the fingertips like my skin had remembered every moment I'd been told to tone it down, share credit, or wait your turn, always followed by a pat on the shoulder and someone else walking off with the spotlight. I opened the hallway closet. On the top shelf sat a canvas bag, still sealed with a rusted clip. I hadn't unwrapped it since relocating to the cabin. Inside was the full set, polished boots, creased jacket insignias, aligned like punctuation marks on a story no one finished telling. I laid the pieces out one by one on the bed, then folded them back tighter this time until the seams ran parallel and the fabric felt almost industrial. There was no ceremony, only precision. When I placed the bag in storage, I didn't mark the box. Just set it alongside winter gear and old cables items you keep, not because you'll use them, but because throwing them out feels like admitting something didn't last. My phone buzzed again, this time from an unknown number. I let it ring, but it didn't stop. Finally, I swiped up. Her voice arrived before her name did. Lauren, it's your mother. I didn't answer. We'd appreciate it if you could arrive early. Your father prefers the photo be taken before the guests. Another pause. The front row will be for the men, of course, but we've made space next to the donors' wives for you. We thought that would feel familiar. Click. I left the phone face-down screen pressed into the wooden counter. The grain left faint marks across the glass when I picked it up later. That night, I re-oiled the hinges of the back door, not because they needed it, but because the rhythm of motion without result felt honest. The cloth I used was torn from an old field shirt, threadbare, and soft from too many cycles through harsh water. It smelled faintly of gunmetal and citrus soap. I let the kettle whistle long before lifting it. I let the mug cool before touching it. I read through Cole Mattry's note again, just 4 words. Thanks for not leaving me. I hadn't responded. I hadn't needed to. Outside, the wind moved the tops of pine trees in circular patterns, not forward. Like the forest had learned that progress isn't always linear. I never expected my family to become the kind of force I'd need tactics to survive. But there they were, deploying the language of affection to protect the optics of legacy. A request for unity not rooted in memory or care, but in coverage. In the cabin's quiet, I didn't mourn the invitation. I mourned the fact that it was predictable. At 5:49 a.m. I turned on the small battery lamp by the window. The bulb flickered once, then steadied. I flipped open the tactics log again and wrote one more line beneath the old pencil scrawl. You're only invited back when your presence protects their story. And that was never the story I agreed to carry. Some shifts happen so slowly you don't realize they've already taken root, until the morning feels different and you can't remember the last time you waited for someone to call. The kettle had a small dent near the handle now. I hadn't noticed it before. Maybe it came from the move, or maybe it had always been there, softened into the metal like old disappointments no longer worth naming. I filled it halfway, set it on the stovetop, and reached for the small watering can near the door. The porch plants, rosemary marjoram, one stubborn pot of mint, greeted me with their silence. They didn't need praise. They just grew. Inside, the cabin had taken on the feel of something lived in. Not filled, just lived in. I'd added a low shelf built by hand from salvaged wood, where I stacked books with dog-eared corners. A map of the Ozarks folded in quarters sat beside a mason jar of spare nails. Next to it, a clay dish held 4 paper clips, 1 brass button, and a pebble shaped like a comma. all things I didn't need but hadn't been able to discard. On the desk, a narrow lamp cast its soft yellow arc over a small leather-bound notebook. The cover bore no title, but I'd scrawled one across the first page in faint pencil: Survival Protocols for the Quiet After. Not meant for publication, not even for sharing, just field notes for a life rebuilt from silence. 12 hours a week. That's what the contract offered: remote threat analysis for an NGO focused on digital protections in vulnerable communities. No ranks, no medals, just encryption keys patterns and risk matrices. The quiet kind of work, like planting seeds you might never see bloom. There were no metrics to hit, no press, no uniform. I didn't need anyone to know I was still capable, only that I was still choosing. A letter came once a week from Cole Matry, sometimes typed, sometimes scribbled on lined paper from the rehab center's therapy room. He wrote about the lake outside the gravel path he walked twice a day, and the counselor with the old Doberman who watched the sessions like a senri. Once he sent a page torn from Field and Stream, circled in red ink. A woman in Montana built a fly rod from a broom handle and caught a 9-pound trout. No context, just the story. I mailed back 2 books and a pack of licorice. On the inside flap of Meditations, I underlined a line and left no note. He'd know where to look. I spent afternoons sanding down an old bench I'd found in the back shed, smoothing out the splinters with steady, even strokes. The radio played low AM stations with static-rich bluegrass and local weather reports. I let it speak into the corners of the room like an old friend who didn't require a reply. In the evenings, I wrote. Not for the military, not for the family legacy, just for the girl. I used to be the one who asked too many questions in officer school and didn't care if she was liked as long as the job was clean. Rachel Ortiz's letter arrived in a manila envelope tucked under my porch mat. The handwriting was even precise. She had attended one of the cybersecurity panels I gave back when I still accepted invitations under the Ashford name. Her message was short. I want to serve, but I don't want to be shaped by what isn't true. How do you keep your back straight when they ask you to bend no header, no sign-off? Just that. I read it twice, then once more aloud, not for meaning, just to feel the shape of her doubt in the air. I thought of the brass pins they handed out for exemplary alignment, and the hallway outside the office where my nameplate used to be. I didn't have an answer, only a practice. I wrote 1 sentence in return and folded it into a plain envelope. No return address. Hold your spine steady, in shadow or light. No more than that. Advice has weight when it's too long. It's easier to carry when it fits in a pocket. The mailbox at the edge of the gravel road hadn't been painted in years. A web of old rust branched across the bottom like roots. Still, it held the letter. Some nights I slept with the lamp on, not from fear, but because I liked the way the shadows fell across the pine walls. The worn wool blanket still held the scent of cedar. Sometimes I reached for it without thinking, like I once did for a service weapon or an ops tablet. Not out of habit, but because it reminded me that warmth, like trust, didn't announce itself. It simply stayed or didn't. No one called to check in. No one asked if I missed the mission briefings or the holidays. I stopped expecting it. The porch light didn't burn for visitors. It glowed for me in case I forgot how far I'd come. At the back of the bookshelf behind the policy binders and laminated directives I couldn't throw away just yet, I tucked a black and white photo. Not of the team. Not of a medal ceremony. Just me and Pop, fishing rods in hand, both of us squinting into the sun. I hadn't smiled like that in years. He used to whistle low when he watched the news, When I once asked why he looked at the screen, then at me, because sometimes the people telling it weren't the ones who lived it. He was gone before the promotion, before the reassignment, but I still heard his voice in my head, clear as gravel under boots. Don't wait for them to call it courage. Just keep walking. The cabin didn't echo like the barracks. It breathed. No framed degrees on the wall. No last names engraved in silver. Just a small chipped bowl by the sink, where I kept the shells of pistachios I cracked while reading. Each one a reminder even something hard-shelled gives way with time. I didn't need anyone to say I'd done enough. I only needed to know I wasn't doing it for them anymore. And that was enough. Some endings don't echo. They just stop, like a breath you didn't realize you'd been holding. The envelope was black. Not the kind reserved for grief or threat, but something in between, unmistakably deliberate. I'd ordered it weeks ago, along with a wax seal I'd never used before. The imprint was a simple arc, half a circle, half a boundary. I melted the wax over the back flap and pressed down with the weight of my palm instead of a stamp. The heat didn't scald. It yielded. Inside, I had folded one letter. No heading, no embellishment. Just typewritten lines on bone-white paper, my full name at the top, my decision beneath it. I, Lauren Ashford Rain, formally relinquish all present and future association with the Ashford family name in matters of inheritance property, claims, public appearances, ceremonial representation, or posthumous reference. This includes, but is not limited to, land rights, naming rights, media claims, service records, commemorative dedications, or familial inclusion of any kind. No signature, just the name typed. I enclosed one more item, a scanned, notarized copy of the legal request to strike Ashford from all active military citations and public databases. The original was already on file. At the post office, the clerk didn't look twice. He weighed the letter, placed it in the outgoing bin, and handed me the receipt with a soft stamp over the barcode. I folded it into a side pocket of my wallet and left it there behind the laminated card of my blood type and the faded emergency contact info I no longer needed. On the walk back, the soles of my boots caught in soft clumps of pine needles. I passed the edge of town where the road thinned into gravel and the houses became fewer. The wind shifted east, carrying the dry smell of leaves, curling into themselves. I didn't flinch when dust settled onto my coat sleeve. I kept walking. I'd meant to go straight home. Instead, my steps turned left toward a fenced patch of land just beyond the trailhead, where thought oak still stood thick and low-limbed, its bark darkened by decades of memory and names carved into its body. I hadn't been there since the year we buried the time capsule. It was supposed to be opened during the Ashford centennial, but I already knew what was in it. Photos, bronze pin, a letter from my grandfather about legacy. I dug slowly. The tin box was rusted through on one side. I didn't open it. Instead, I pulled the other item from my bag, a velvet pouch, cinched shut with military ribbon. Inside the family crest, gilded in brass. It had been affixed to my lapel during commissioning, held in place by a pin that left a scar on the inside of my collarbone. I had been told to wear it with pride. I had worn it with silence. The soil gave easily under the roots. I buried the crest in the ground beneath the tree, not in protest, but in finality. No marker, no prayer. By the time I returned to the cabin, the light had shifted. Inside, the tea kettle had cooled beside the stove. I poured water anyway and set a chamomile bag in the mug with the chipped rim. The thread curled down like a question. I didn't answer it. On the bookshelf was the journal I had started 3 winters ago. Most pages were filled with strategic frameworks repurposed for personal life triage methods, tactical quiet, civilian disengagement. The corner of one page was turned where I had written in red pencil, reintegration. I drew a clean line through the word. Beneath it, I wrote, slowly, deliberately, I was never meant to return to a place that never made space for me. Then I closed the journal. There had been no calls, no follow-up messages. The silence from my family was not absence. It was a pattern. Once it would have driven me to reassert my worth, to reach back with outstretched hands and proof of value. I had nothing to prove now. I reached for the old wool blanket, folded on the edge of the couch. It still held the faint scent of cedar and mint oil. It had once belonged to a medic I served with in Kandahar. She gave it to me without a word, after a failed recon left us waiting 9 hours for exfil. We didn't speak of it. Some gifts don't require wrapping or explanation. I tucked the blanket over my legs and watched the fire fade into embers. The wood crackled low, each sound gentle and complete. Nothing begged to be heard. Nothing needed to be loud. On the floor beside me, a box sat open. It held the last of the medals I hadn't yet sorted, not because they were important, but because they no longer dictated anything. I didn't display them. I didn't deny them. They simply existed, remnants of chapters that once shaped, but no longer defined me. One had a faint scratch across its surface. I remembered the day it was pinned, how the general's cufflink had snagged the edge of my dress blues. He didn't notice. I did. I reached in and laid that medal flat against the lid of the box face down. It didn't resist. I covered it with a folded cloth. That evening, I made lentil soup. Nothing added, nothing removed. I ate in silence. The radio played an old folk song from the 1930s, static, soft at the edges. The singer's voice didn't rise above the instruments. I found myself humming once, then let the note fall away. I didn't reach for it again. Before bed, I opened the drawer of my desk and removed a small card I hadn't touched in months. It was from Sergeant Matry, the first thank you I'd ever received without expectation. His handwriting had softened with time, the edges of the card bent just slightly at the corners. I ran a finger over his words but didn't reread them. I slid it back into its envelope, then into a drawer now half empty. The contents that remained weren't evidence of anything, just selections. Choices kept not for nostalgia, but for stillness. There were no sirens in this chapter, no confrontation, no reckoning scene under dramatic lights, just a long, slow breath that finally released. Some people mistake endings for explosions, but some doors close so quietly you only realize it later, when the air changes, when the draft is gone, and the silence feels complete rather than cold. I didn't light anything on fire. I didn't scream. I didn't need to. I walked away not to be seen walking, but because my feet finally knew which direction felt like peace. And sometimes peace isn't a destination, it's the decision not to return. No one called this morning, and no one needed to. There was a soft draft near the floorboards, the kind you don't notice until the steam from your cup leans slightly to one side. I didn't move to close the gap. The silence wasn't cold. It was clean. On the table, the Earl Grey had cooled just enough to sip without wincing. The rim of the ceramic mug bore a faint chip where it once knocked against my boot heel. I didn't replace it. The cup still held what it was meant to hold. I'd left the meditations open from last night. A folded corner marked a passage I'd read more times than I admitted even to myself. Happiness is living in accordance with one's nature. The page smelled faintly of smoke and dust, the kind of dust that settles slowly, not from neglect, but from use. Pinned above the desk was a rectangle of olive-green parachute cloth, frayed at the edges, torn clean through one corner. The tear had happened the day Sergeant Cole Metry had gone down. That was before they revised the mission logs, before my name stopped appearing in summaries. I found the fabric again months later, packed inside a rucksack no one claimed. Now it served as a board. 3 pushpins held a single card scented in the cloth. Matry's handwriting was tight, all caps. The card was blank on the back. You never walked away. Below it, a paper scrap curled slightly in humidity, Rachel Ortiz's latest letter. The ink bled just a little at the corner where her pen must have paused. She'd written, "I've started near the border this time. I keep that line of yours in my chest pocket, the one about standing tall even in the dark." I hadn't meant it as a line, but I knew what she meant. The spoon beside my cup was old army issue. I stirred nothing with it. I just liked the weight. Outside, the wind nudged the corner of the tarp I'd draped over the woodpile. I didn't secure it again. The forecast was dry, and the wind could do as it pleased. There was a small mirror in the corner I rarely used. It had once been bolted to a locker door. The glass was uneven, slightly warped. You could look into it and not see quite yourself, but something quieter. Something finished. Today I pulled the chair closer to the window instead. The light through the pine needles had a gentler rhythm than the harsh white of ceiling fluorescence, the kind that always made my uniform feel tighter at the collar. I didn't wear uniforms now. There were no name tags here, no insignia. My name wasn't stitched over my chest, and no one called roll. The only label that mattered was the one inside my flannel, faded to the point of anonymity. It still kept me warm. I'd patched the elbow seam last week. Mended, not replaced. There was a quiet discipline in that, choosing to keep what works, not what shines. The mailbox hadn't held anything urgent in weeks, just the right kind of mail. Quiet mail. Catalogues I didn't subscribe to, envelopes with prepaid return slips, a handwritten note from the corner bookstore, thanking me for the last recommendation. Once, I would have catalogued these details as distractions. Now they felt like proof of something sturdier. The tactical field book I kept nearby had lost its original cover. The black tape I'd wrapped around it peeled slightly near the spine. On the last clean page, I wrote nothing. Not yet. I let the pen rest across the page, undecided. I didn't need to plan anymore. Not in the old way. Not with grids and contingencies. My days weren't battles now. They were hours, and hours could be enough. I remembered a voice once telling me, if no one's watching, it doesn't count. It used to echo. Now, it didn't. The kettle whistled and I let it. Some sounds are better unhurried. I poured the rest into the cup without measuring. There were no standard issue rations here, no clocks to sync. The patch of pine needles near the porch had grown thick this season. I didn't sweep them. Letting them fall felt right. They made a kind of hush when you stepped over them, like the world whispering to itself. I used to think silence meant absence. Now I knew better. Silence, when chosen, was presence in its most honest form. A student had once asked, during a briefing, "Ma'am, do you ever worry that no one will remember what you did?" There hadn't been time for a proper answer, but I'd written the question down in the margin of my notes. Now, I didn't worry. Memory wasn't the goal. Integrity wasn't a headline. It was how you brewed your tea, how you answered a letter, how you stood still when others ran toward noise. I took the meditations off the table and slid it back into its place on the second shelf beside the dog-eared field guide to edible plants. A cotton bookmark stained with ink hung between pages like a flag left up after the ceremony ends. I didn't celebrate days anymore. I marked them only by what stayed still and what moved. Today the wind had moved. The firewood stayed still. That was enough. The candle stub on the sill had burned down to the coil in its center. I didn't relight it. Light wasn't always necessary. Presence didn't need to be seen. The pen I used had been a gift long ago. The engraving was scratched off now. I liked it better that way, no initials, no dedication, just a tool. It fit better in the hand like that. I turned back to the last page of the notebook. The lines were faint, the kind of lines that invited you to write only what you meant. I waited, and then I wrote, sometimes quiet. Living is the loudest answer. I didn't underline it. I didn't frame it. I didn't turn the page. There was nothing else I needed to add.